This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a professor of government and law at Lafayette College in the United States, whose most recent work focuses on quote-unquote hegemonic victimhood in Israel. Professor Ilan Peleg, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So I think it was the comedian Jackie Mason who said that every Jewish holiday can be summarized into one sentence. They tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. What I'm trying to say here is that victimhood has been a Jewish trait from the dawn of time. So my question to you is, what's new about Israel?
Yes, I definitely agree that victimhood is very much inherent in the Jewish tradition, but I want to emphasize that this is not only in the traditional holidays like Pesach, Hanukkah, Purim and so forth, but in Israel it is now also very much built into, of course, Yom HaShoah, Yom Yerushalayim, and the rest of them.
But it makes sense that a Jewish state would replicate Jewish traditions.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, the Jewish Revolution, otherwise known as Zionism, was conceived originally as exactly interrupting this particular process. The whole idea of Theodor Herzl and others was to take the Jews out of Europe, thereby stopping actually two processes. Number one, the process of victimization of the Jews, and number two, changing victimhood, in other words, changing the psychology of the Jews. Mm-hmm. So in this regard, I think the modern Israel experience is a failure in many ways.
Modern Israel, you mean only the last years, or is it something that we've seen really from the beginning of Zionism, of the Zionist settlement in Palestine?
Well, that's very interesting. I think that in the early years of the State of Israel, and I grew up during the early years of the Israeli experience, the Shoah and victimhood has been de-emphasized, and Israeliness itself was perceived as a revolution against the tradition and changing it very dramatically.
Despite the temporal proximity. So just a few years after the Holocaust, the state of mind was completely opposite. And the more we move along the spectrum of time, the more this phenomenon intensifies.
Yes, and I think a very important year in marking this tendency is during the Mahapach, or the arrival at power of Menachem Begin. I'm being interviewed here in the Begin Center, so this is a little bit important. And my first book was actually a political biography of Menachem Begin. Mm-hmm. And Begin, of course, was a model of a Jew who came from Brest-Litovsk. He suffered from the Holocaust. Many members of his family died in the Holocaust. So in many ways, his victimhood was very organic. And victimhood, I think, in general, was associated with right-wing Israeli politics. Mm-hmm. My argument is that victimhood has now become more and more generalized, much more hegemonic in the Israeli society in its totality.
So what does it mean exactly, hegemonic? That it has really become the paradigm of Israeliness?
Yes, I would say that it has become hegemonic in the sense that, for example, the political writer, leader of the Communist Party in Italy, Antonio Gramsci, thought about it. He talks about hegemonia, or hegemony in Italian, which is a set of ideas that people never even think about challenging. So I think in this regard, victimhood, in my opinion, had become very, very hegemonic in the Gramscian sense of the word.
So is this really a sign of the weakness and yet another sign of the weakness of the left in Israel?
Yes, I think to some extent you can look at it as a weakness of a more universalist, or as people would very generally refer to it, left-wing Israeli perception. Mm-hmm. And so I think, for example, the status of the Shoah and the way you relate to the Shoah is an example of that. Mm-hmm. You can look at the Shoah in a universalistic kind of way, as to what people can do to other people under certain circumstances, and a universalist message coming out of it, you can look at the Shoah also as very particularistically as to what the Goyim are doing to the Jews. I think that the dominant model has been the particularistic model.
So that begs the question whether this state of mind of victimhood is a natural reaction to the circumstances, living in a hostile environment here in the Middle East, or a self-fulfilling prophecy. You mentioned Begin and maybe other politicians and Israelis as well who have suffered so much persecution that they look around them and all they see are enemies. As I think Churchill said, even paranoid people have enemies.
Yes, and I think that Churchill, as usual, is right, and I think that both factors are important. So I think it's important to realize that Jews have, in fact, been persecuted throughout their history. My own family lost a lot of members in the Shoah, so were numerous millions of other families, and so on and so forth. So I think victimhood is rooted in an actual experience. But the question is, what do you do with it? I mean, are you going to perpetuate it, develop it, or are you going to turn your own victimhood into a more constructive, positive force?
Because there were people, I mean, Begin is just one example, but there were quite a few Holocaust survivors, people who really lost everything in the war, who drew a wholly different conclusion from it, as you say.
Yes, and I think that this is a challenge for the Israeli society, and by the way, to Jews in general, because I think victimhood has also impacted American Jews and people in other diasporas all over the world. And the question is, what are we going to do with this experience?
Okay, so how do you change it? I mean, it is an obvious or natural reaction to persecution. How do you convince people that to turn away from that natural reaction?
This is exactly the reason I have decided to organize this particular panel here, because I think that the victimhood has become so hegemonic, so dominant in the Israeli society, that I think it's a very, very dangerous reaction, in the sense that it is indeed, as you referred to it before, and as I referred to it in my own article, a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, if you see yourself as a victim, you will behave as a victim, and sooner or later people will start looking at you as a victim.
So is this the role of the leadership? I mean, Netanyahu has made quite a bit of political capital out of evoking the Second World War and equating Iran to Nazi Germany every now and again.
And not only that, talking about the Mufti Hajj Amin al-Husseini is sort of a continuation. He did not say it, but sort of as a generalized anti-Semitic being.
No, but my question is, does it change from the top, or do we need a more rigorous process to change that?
Well, I think one of the functions of academia, if I may say so, because this is an academic interview, is to challenge existing belief systems. And certainly as a political scientist, I see my own role within society, whether it's in America or here or other places, is asking interesting questions about existing belief systems.
Do you see similar processes among diaspora Jewry, especially in America, your home for several decades?
Not enough. I would love to see more people challenging existing political...
No, but my question is this sense of victimhood shared also by diaspora Jews? In the same way or the same patterns that we see in Israel?
To some extent, yes. And here I want to emphasize that not all societies look at themselves as victims. So I think victimhood has been dominant in many different societies. I tend to be very much a comparativist in nature. And you can look at Ireland or the Armenians or the Poles, the Russians, the Chinese, and many others who see themselves as victims. I think the American society in general does not look itself as victims. But I think American Jewry within the United States very often did adopt this sort of Holocaust-centered kind of position, which lead you sometimes inevitably toward looking at yourself as a victim.
And in America, it was the same process as it was here, that in the early years after the Holocaust, we saw something different, and gradually we slipped back to this discourse of victimhood?
Yes, I think to some extent, yes. And I think that ironically here, and this is full of ironies, the 1967 war, which many of us have seen as redemptive and as establishing Jewish power, has also become an important point to bringing us back to the idea of victimhood.
How so?
I think that the pre-1967 war, and I still remember those days because I was a soldier in the military and already in reserves, I think that the period known as the Hamtana, or the crisis leading eventually to the war, it created a tremendous amount of anxiety, people talking about the second Holocaust, and I think this to a large extent...
But then they were proved wrong.
That's right. But nevertheless, I think the continuation of the conflict that we have with the Arab world, and indeed I would say the growing isolation of Israel today, really brings back this old-time notion of victimhood, which again I think that ironically fits much better the existence of East European Jews in the shtetl and the Jewish conditions in general in a pre-Zionist period.
Yeah.
And I don't think fits particularly well into, the most powerful army in the Middle East and all of that.
So is this really the failure of Zionism, that the strong and powerful state of Israel could not liberate the Jews from this state of mind? They could take the Jews out of Europe, but couldn't take Europe out of the Jews?
Yeah, I think to a large extent you can look at Herzlian Zionism as a rebellion against Jewish history. And in this sense, Theodor Herzl, despite his greatness, failed to actually change the fundamental perception of Jews as themselves as victims. So, in some extent, we still do live in the shtetl, despite all the power that we have. And this is exactly the challenge that I want to throw at the community.
Do you see any incipient trends to the contrary, any powers pushing for a return to perhaps the pre-67 years when change was possible, when the revolution seemed like it was going to succeed?
Yes, I do think that people are working on it, and in this regard, your listeners may want to go back and see the speech that Yitzhak Rabin gave in the Knesset immediately after he got back to power in 1992. And he gave a speech, and I don't have it before me, so I'm going to quote from memory, but he said something to the extent, it's about time we go down from a Masada or Metzada in Hebrew, and stop thinking about yourself as if we are surrounded by the Romans about to attack. Exactly.
And we all know what happened to him.
Yeah, and by the way, this is against Golda Meir, who admitted in a way, quote unquote, that we all live on the Metzada. And so, you ask yourself, so what is the difference that Herzl actually made in terms of the psychology of the Jews?
And Netanyahu only recently said that Israel is going to live forever by the sword. So it's the same state of mind that still persists, even to a larger extent today.
Yes, I think that Netanyahu, as I say in my paper, is a heavy user of the victimhood lingo. And his reference recently, which I thought was sort of interesting, to the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, as being the initiator of the Holocaust, was very interesting. It's also important, by the way, to mention that the Germans immediately protested this and said, no, the Mufti did not do it. We did it. So I think the Germans claimed the responsibility because it's part of their own DNA. So, this entire situation is full of ironies, just endless.
Very unfortunate and sad ironies.
Yes.
This is life here in Israel. Professor Ilan Peleg, thank you very much for joining me today. You're a professor of government and law at Lafayette College in the United States. Thank you very much for talking to us about hegemonic victimhood in Israel today.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you. And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for the generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.